Okay, they really should have released this episode last week in addition to episode 1, because my thoughts last week would have been much more positive. Because this episode really makes a nice continuation of last week's episode. Because last week's episode didn't really have much world building. It was just a nice little catching up with the characters. But this episode has a lot more adventure. It really expands the world. It has great action. This episode kind of reminded me of The Hobbit, when the dwarves and Gandalf are trapped in the minds of the goblins. It was very reminiscent of that, especially the part where Mando was kind of being roasted on a spit a little bit. I was like, that's kind of like what the goblins did in the Hobbit. And the effects in this episode were state-of-the-art. The droid and creatures, I believe, for the most part, those were practical effects. And if there was CGI, then you could barely tell. They were really well done, especially that creature near the end. Like, this spider droid, who was sort of the villain in this episode, was really creepy. Like, seeing it crawl around the mines, then come out of its shell to reveal a smaller version of itself. That was really creative. He made a nice little threat in this episode. And I did enjoy the conversation between Din and Bo-Katan this episode. It gave Bo-Katan a little bit more of an interesting backstory, made it clear what her motives are, and it expanded the rules of the Mandalorians and their culture and how it works. But I do feel the episode did focus a bit too much on Bo-Katan. Mando felt kind of sidelined in this episode. He gets captured in the mines, so Grogu flies the ship back to Bo-Katan, and then they fly back to the mines, and she rescues him. And my worry with this season is that it's going to have the same problem as Season 2, where it focused more on what character is going to show up this week, and it didn't really give Mando much character development. I'm worried that he's going to continue to be more of a side character, while the other characters do all the grunt work. But overall, I enjoyed this episode a bit more than last week's. I really like seeing Bo with the Darksaber. That was really awesome. And it felt more focused from a plot perspective. It didn't feel overstuffed with way too much going on like last week. And the way this episode ends, wow, it has me thoroughly excited for next week's episode. Because I cannot wait to possibly see Bo and Din, possibly Grogu, fighting the Mythosaur. I hope it ends up being as awesome as I hope it's going to be. So let me know what your thoughts on this week's episode of Mandalore were. I will see you next week.